On today's show, a new era for the Locked On NHL Prospects podcast, as well as a deep dive into the game of Ivan Ryabkin, potentially the most divisive prospect in the 2025 NHL draft class.
You are Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, and welcome back to Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On this show, we break down everything prospects related for you 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. My name is Sebastian High. I'm the USHL scout over at Elite Prospects. And as of today, this is the first episode. I'm now also the one and only host of this podcast. For those of you who may have missed it, Hadi Kalikesh, my co-host for the last year and a half, has had to step away from the podcast to focus his time and energy on other things because he was juggling a lot of different things. So his time here on the podcast unfortunately came to an end. We're going to remain close friends and close colleagues with our work over at Elite Prospects, and I'm sure he'll be back for a guest appearance here every now and again. But for the time being, it is now me who's going to be the host here for most episodes. So I would love to also hear from you in the comments. What are some of your favorite stories or memories of Hadi here on the podcast, as well as perhaps what are some of the ideas that you have for where you'd be curious for this podcast to go, in what direction, what kinds of series or episodes would you be interested in seeing? Because this is a time of change here now for the podcast, and there are a couple different things that I'm going to be exploring, one of which you'll be seeing in this episode already, with my use of a tactics board while breaking down the habits and intelligence of players here in the Prospect Spotlight series. But again, would love to hear your feedback, your ideas, your questions as well about the podcast and what direction it's going into. I'm going to be doing a mailbag episode this week, so please leave any questions you have, whether it's about the podcast or just about your favorite prospects or players that you're curious about. Leave any of those questions down below. But before we jump into the entire episode here today with Ivan Ryabkin, today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 moneyline bet. That's $150 if your team wins. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. So let's start off here with Ivan Ryabkin, a player from my region, the USHL, and someone that I've been paying very close attention to, especially going back to November when we first started hearing inklings that he might be making a move over from Russia to the USHL. So who is this player? Ivan Ryabkin is a 6-foot, 198-pound left shot centerman from Russia who broke records in the Russian junior circuit last year in the NHL. Had some fantastic levels of production, 24 goals and 58 points in 44 games for Dynamo Moscow in the NHL. Very involved playmaker, shown with his physicality, captained Russia at their U17 tournament against the likes of Belarus, where he scored 4 goals and 11 points in 6 games. It was a very noteworthy D-1 campaign that got him into the spotlight and eyes of much of the hockey community. And coming into this season, he was pretty much a consensus top 5 contender at the very least. And he was inside that top 5 on a lot of boards. He still finds himself at 3rd on the NHL Central Scouting EU skater list, which does not make him a top 5 or top 10 even pick in their evaluation, but he is still high up there. But this is still a player that has fallen down draft boards this season. And today we're going to be breaking down a little bit of why that's been the case, where his development is going, what habits are in his game, as well as what he can do to maybe mend this trend a little bit. And it's been a really erratic season for this player. He's played in 4 different lineups in all 3 levels of the Dynamo Moscow system, played 2 games in the KHL, 8 games in the VHL, which is the minor leagues, so still professional hockey against men, got 2 assists in those 8 games, and played 15 games in the NHL that he dominated last season and only scored 1 goal and 12 points in that span. It was a year of regression. Also saw a lot more aggression in his physicality and over aggression and taking penalties with 26 penalty minutes in 15 games in the MHL, and that's continued to be the case now that he's moved over to Muskegon, the Muskegon Lumberjacks in the USHL, where in 7 games he's already gotten 23 penalty minutes, 17 of which came in 1 game against the US NTDP and resulted in a suspension for Slewfoot. This is a player that can definitely explode with his physicality at times. So a player that has some really interesting offensive capabilities, especially in the playmaking departments, but who hasn't quite gotten going yet this season. It's been a bit better production-wise in the USHL. 6 goals, 8 points in 7 games for the physical centerman, but a lot of that's come against the U17s and the US NTDP, the U18s. So farming a lot, like all but one of those goals came against those 2 teams, and those are not the strongest teams in the USHL. He's struggled a little bit more to get involved offensively against the older, more physical and stronger opposition in the league. But let's focus here for the second half of the first segment on the puck skills themselves, as well as the physicality and the skating. These are just the raw physical tools, not how they combine. We'll look at that in the next segment. So starting off, we're going to look here at the shooting. This is something that might look very good on paper at first. 6 goals in 7 games since coming over to North America is really good numbers. 1 goal in 25 games previous to that in Russia, less good. Mechanically, the shot isn't something particularly special. This isn't a guy that's going to unleash howitzers with his one-timer on the power play, be a trigger man. He's much more of an opportunistic goal scorer. He gets into goal-scoring areas off puck, drifts into that mid-slot, tries to just ride defenders' blind spots. He's not the most effective at using his physicality to create that space for himself in the middle of the ice. He's more of a kind of player that chases hits and goes for like a big physical implication when he's frustrated, and that can look quite impressive and quite strong, but it's often without much purpose. So the way that the physicality combines with the goal scoring is definitely an area to improve, which we'll look at in the next segment. But yeah, the goal scoring, its intelligent off-puck movement is how he scored most of his goals here in the USHL, and also very much taking advantage of more immature defenders here in the USHL, and he's done quite a good job at that in terms of finding space down low against those weaker teams. It gets more interesting, in my opinion, in terms of the puck skills with the handling and the playmaking. He's a quite deft puck handler. He can handle comfortably at his top speeds. He's not the most creative of puck handlers, but he can solve single layers of pressure quite effectively. And the way that interacts with his playmaking is very interesting as well. But the playmaking is in and of itself probably the best of these puck skills. He has really good vision, especially when he's in motion, when he's going through his handling, and the passing ability really shines with that foundation. He can pick passes between 2-3 layers of pressure and layers of defense. He can try passes that don't succeed. This was something that I think we saw a lot in Russia this season, of him trying to be the guy that just dominates every single shift on the ice by believing that he would, and by just trying any play that he wanted to, which wasn't really very efficient. He was wasting a lot of possession, throwing it away quite regularly, trying to make the perfect play. And we've still seen some flashes of that in the USHL. He's not the most connective give and go kind of passer at this stage. Not all that much pace in his passing implications, but still, in terms of the raw passing mechanics and the flashes of vision, very impressive stuff. The skating is interesting. There has to be a separation here between the skating mechanics and the motor. The motor and the intensity is at the core of the question marks with this player, and we'll really dive into that in the next segment. But the skating, in terms of what it is fine. It's pretty passable. It's average. He doesn't have separation speed. He's not going to be a guy that's going to lead your rushes single-handedly and pushing back defenses with pace. That's not his game whatsoever. But he's a decent enough mover. He can get into positions and he can recover when he's behind a play. But just because he can does not mean he does, and that's I think a big part of the problem with Ryabkin this season. But still, I think that the skating has some room to grow as well, especially that energy can ramp up a little bit. And at the same time, as I kind of alluded to earlier, the physicality is interesting. There's a real basis of strength. He has a really solid foundation. I mean, 6 feet, over 200 pounds. He's really difficult to push off the puck. And he can really plant himself and become an immovable object in board battles. But more often than not, the physicality isn't in terms of initiating contact to create a couple feet of space and do something with that on puck, or doing that off puck to try to maybe disrupt things a little bit, create space for his teammates. It's less proactive. It's more reactionary. When he's frustrated, when a pass doesn't connect, when he misses a goal scoring opportunity, you're probably going to see later on that shift or on the very next shift, there's going to be a defender in the corner. He's going to dump the puck away. Ryabkin's going to come in with a really hard hit into the boards. It's going to be about maybe a half second later than you'd want it to be. Not late enough for a penalty, usually, but not really effective or not productive in any way, and takes himself out of the play while doing so. And when he's out of the play, he struggles to get back into it because of, again, the motor. So that wraps up the first segment here with the actual tools, both the physical tools and the puck skills. In the next segment, we're going to break down the overall toolkit, how these things interact in his game, as well as his habits, where I'll be breaking out the tactics board. All that and a lot more after this message from our sponsors. Super Bowl 59 is here. One game, two teams, endless possibilities. And there's no better way to make every play more exciting than with FanDuel Sportsbook. Whether it's predicting the first touchdown, calling the MVP, or even betting on the coin toss, FanDuel makes it easy to get in on the action. With live betting all game long, you can adjust your bets as the game unfolds and feel the thrill from kickoff to the final whistle. The live betting feature lets you stay involved no matter what happens on the field, and the app is super easy to navigate. Plus, knowing that you can place a $5 bet and potentially win $200 in bonus bets for the Super Bowl, that's the icing on the cake. Download the app or head to fanduel.com to get started. Bet just $5, and if you win, you'll score $200 in bonus bets. That's fanduel.com. Bet with FanDuel, official partner of Super Bowl 59. All right, let's keep this episode rolling here in the second segment by breaking down this player's toolkit, because Ivan Ryabkin has some really interesting dynamics in how his tools interact and how they can at their peak potential and how they are when things aren't going so well. We're going to do that first, and then we're going to look into the habits in a bit more detail on the board. So I think one of the really interesting parts in Ryabkin's game is how his playmaking and handling interact. When he's on his game, when things are rolling, going smoothly, and he's feeling confident on the ice, this is a player who can spot really interesting passing lanes and passing opportunities for dangerous scoring chances in motion through his handling. And when that connects and when it flows, he can be a really dynamic playmaker in that sense. There's flashes of deception with the handling, making defenders bite, with changing his body weight to the outside, cutting back inside. This is a player that can really manipulate opponents when he's on his game. But that inconsistency has been at the core of the question marks this season. And just like all the other aspects of his game, that hasn't been there every shift, every period, every game this season. Beyond that, I think that the goal scoring is something that needs to evolve a little bit. This is a physical player. He needs to learn to use that physicality a bit more proactively, but there's runway with this profile. He's strong. He can force his way into dangerous areas around the net front, box out defenders, try to gain some space, fall into pockets of space into that mid slot, backing away from defenders if the puck is behind the net, and really accessing that space as it evolves throughout the cycle. And I think that using the proactive physicality is going to be key to him being able to do this kind of role at the NHL level. At the moment, he's getting by just with clever off puck movement, but initiating contact and kind of setting the dominoes in motion in terms of falling to that space being created, I think is going to be very important, because he's just a bit too passive as things stand to be a consistent goal scoring threat down low. And again, that release isn't overly special. He's not the biggest threat to score from distance. Next, I wanted to highlight as well how the pace and the playmaking are at a disconnect. And a lot of this is down to that motor again, but he's rarely accessing his top speeds. And with that, he's not forcing defenses into uncomfortable positions while handling the puck oftentimes. And this is a play that we have seen in flashes succeed as a playmaker, pushing defenses back, as I mentioned, with that handling combination, really being manipulative and forcing defenders to make uncomfortable decisions. And that just hasn't been there every game this season. Again, it's been there in flashes, and that is the reason that this is a divisive prospect. There are very clear question marks, weaknesses, areas that need a lot of work before he's going to be an NHL or any capacity, let alone a really impactful one inside of like maybe a second line. These are questions that impact him right now, and I think that this is a player who will need to find a bit more fluidity and comfort in layering his tools together at higher speeds, at higher paces, because at a smaller rink, especially here in the USHL, playing against teams like the Lincoln Stars, he becomes very ineffective in the offensive zone and struggles to really create much through his playmaking, really being more of an off-puck offensive piece, trying to maybe tug at defensive structures a little bit from the inside, but struggling to be overly proactive with the puck on his stick. But we're going to look a bit more at the defensive habits here on the tactics board, as well as the impact that his pace has on where he finds himself on the ice. For our podcast listeners, I'll be describing everything I say on the tactics board as clearly as I can. Of course, you'd be more than welcome to check out the YouTube video as well for the visuals of the tactics board. But a lot of what I'll be saying, I will also try to be referring to with where on the ice these things are happening. So hopefully you get a good sense of this player's habits, even without the visual cues. So let's jump right into that. All right, so here is the tactics board. We see here in yellow the Muskegon Lumberjacks. The only number correlating to a specific player here is number 10, Ivan Ryabkin. He is playing center in this game on the top line for the Lumberjacks. They end up losing this game by a pretty big margin, by at least 3 goals. I believe it was a 7-3 scoreline for the Lincoln Stars in this game. And Ryabkin played a big role for Muskegon in terms of creating offense, but was struggling to break down the defensive structure because Lincoln is one of the more organized teams in the USHL. We're going to look at the defensive habits here first with Ivan Ryabkin. Going to go with a box +1 formation for the Muskegon Lumberjacks. Ivan Ryabkin, often the +1 in the box +1. In this game early on, we did see him drop quite low in the defensive zone, tracking players back in transition before looking to loop back up with the puck to try to create some offense moving forward. So this was a guy with a bit more activity early on in the game when he had more energy. But one trend we've been seeing a lot with Ryabkin this season is that in this box +1, as the game goes on, Ryabkin likes to float around the blue line up here, not always sticking to a specific assignment, but looking to spring attacks as soon as a turnover is created in order to score. This is not a player that has really had many breakaway opportunities at all this season, whether that be in the USHL or in Russia. So that, I think, goes a bit of a way to tell the story that This cherry picking tendency, these habits to try to cheat for offense a little bit, haven't necessarily been paying dividends. This is a physical player who, when he gets involved defensively, can use his physicality to box guys out around the net front, picking up the spot of a right shot defenseman, for instance, for a battle like in the corner. If the puck goes in there, he can take up that position, and he's a difficult player to move out of that spot with his really sturdy frame. That said, this isn't all been great for Ryabkin defensively, especially when the energy winds down. And oftentimes we see him relying more on wingers of his, like Tynan Lawrence or Vaclav Nestrasil, to do the heavy lifting down low, to drop low to support defensemen if the puck is behind the net, and Ryabkin stays floating up here. In transition, Ryabkin isn't the most dynamic of players. This is a guy that likes to mainly stay off puck, allowing guys like Tynan Lawrence, a D-1, really skilled, pacey player, to do a lot of the puck carrying for him and being a trailing threat to either shoot or pass, for instance, to a guy like Nestrasil off the rush. But in the offensive zone, this isn't the paciest guy that's going to go for very direct attacks. This is a guy that likes to find pockets of space to create from. We see him go low to high quite often, trying to get the puck into positions like this, maybe a little switch with his right D, and try to maybe look for playmaking opportunities either to a bumper guy or towards the back post. This isn't necessarily always the most proactive for Ryabkin. It can be a little bit predictable at times, but with his combination of handling skill and playmaking, there are some real flashes of brilliance with this game. But I would love to see him become a bit more comfortable as a bumper. He has the physicality to play that role very effectively, and he has that one-touch playmaking and handling to make some special things in little flashes and with very few puck touches in tight. But that's still a long ways away. I think this is a guy with a long runway developmentally. He's going to need some time, and he's going to need a lot of hands-on work. He's clearly a very confident player who believes in his abilities, but that confidence has not necessarily translated into projectable habits so far this season, even though there are some inklings of things that could become quite interesting in the future with this player. That passiveness, that lack of energy are real reasons that these ideas in terms of where he would fit into Muskegon's system haven't necessarily been working every single game, but they work very well against younger, more immature, less physical opponents like the US NTDP U18s or U17s. One more thing I want to note with his physicality, for instance, if there's a recovery here in the corner, 6 right D for Lincoln would take it and maybe send the puck up to a streaking winger. Ryabkin would find himself here if he just caused that turnover or there was something to be frustrated about, while his teammates track back, while you see Lincoln progressing for a counter. This is not the most comfortable position to defend for his team. Ryabkin will decide to finish his hit, and then both these players are late in getting to the defense, but oftentimes that is a defenseman for the opposition and a center for Muskegon, and in terms of defensive roles, that is not necessarily the trade that you want to be doing while defending against the rush here. But that wraps things up here in the second segment for this episode. We'll be right back in the third after a quick message from our sponsors. All right, let's wrap up the show here in the final segment on Ivan Ryabkin by looking at this player's projection, both in the draft and in terms of his NHL upside and floor, his NHL player comps, as well as which teams would be good fit for this player come draft day. So on draft day, I think that there's a very big range of possibilities for Ivan Ryabkin. This back half of the season with the Muskegon Lumberjacks is really going to decide where he ends up going here. If he's able to rebound a little bit, show a bit more of that goal scoring, the physicality, and the playmaking at a bit of a higher pace, this could still be a top 15 draft pick. I think that realistically 15 is about the highest he's going to go, with just the amount of question marks surrounding this player at this stage. And there's a lot of competition in that top 15 range of this draft class. But I think that range could extend all the way into like that 40 area of the draft in the upper second round, because again, with pace, motor, intensity being such big question marks, and of course there's still being questions around Ryabkin's own overconfidence in his abilities and forcing his way out of the system in Dynamo Moscow to come to the USHL, and that broke down at first in November before it finally materialized and in early January. This is a guy that could fall on draft day, maybe outside of the first round. And a lot, again, is going to depend on this back half with the Muskegon Lumberjacks, especially how he's going to be combining with guys like Tynan Lawrence and Vaclav Nestrastil as some very skilled, intelligent offensive players playing inside that top six. In terms of NHL projection, NHL upside, Ivan Ryabkin to me has that middle six upside. I don't think that this is a guy with like real clear top six potential from what I'm seeing at the moment. There's flashes of skill, but not overwhelming dynamic abilities, not the most creative player in the draft class. Again, the pace and the motor are questions, but the physicality is something to build around. And again, with the skating as well, you could see that really transform with more energy put into it. So this is a guy I think could totally end up being a physical playmaker in a middle six capacity at the NHL level. A guy that maybe puts up in the range of 30 assists a season, maybe can chip in with 10 to 15 goals alongside that if he's able to really establish himself as your routine everyday middle six center. Maybe that happens on the wing as well, especially with those defensive habits. I don't think that would hurt him too much, but again, with that physicality, you do want him occupying those middle spaces of the ice. In terms of NHL player comps, there's none that are really perfect. I think, like in many cases with prospects, you're never going to see a real like 100% player comp that just fits cleanly. But there's some stylistic comparisons, and I tried to select three players here that hit different areas of Ivan Ryabkin's game. First, we have Pavel Zacha. Ryabkin's smaller, 4 inches smaller. Zacha's a big boy at 6'4", but in terms of the physical implication, how the playmaking is able to work in with that down low, I think there are comparisons there. Zacha's a much higher motor player than Ryabkin is at this stage in his career, and I think he'd have to emulate some of that in order to reach the Zacha kind of impact with the Boston Bruins that we've seen over the past 2 to 3 seasons, being a really effective second line center, especially there in Boston. Ryan Strome of the Anaheim Ducks, another name that comes to mind in terms of that playmaking ability, play creation, connective interplay with his teammates in transition, and his ability to create through one-touch play down low. I think that there's some comparisons there with Ryabkin. Also, I think in terms of defensive impact, Ryan Strome might be a bit more conceivable of a projection than Pavel Zacha would be. And last but not least, we have Casey Middlestat of the Colorado Avalanche, a player with a decent amount of flair and playmaking ability and creativity on puck, something that I would love for Ryabkin to explore a bit more in his game this season that we saw flashes of in his D-1 campaign. I think that these three players are kind of those middle six pieces. Some bring more physicality than others. None of these are perfect Ryabkin comps, but in terms of what he could become in the NHL with good development, if he's able to work on that motor, I think that in terms of impact in a middle six capacity, this is kind of the range of player that we're talking about. So I hope that kind of conveys why this is a guy that could go anywhere between that 15 and 40 range on draft day. There's a lot of work that has to be done for him to reach this kind of upside. But that kind of upside in terms of a potential second line center is really, really valuable and definitely comparable to a 15th overall draft selection. So a lot to like in terms of the ideas behind this player, but still a lot that has to materialize. It remains very theoretical at this point of what he's going to be in the NHL. Finally, here to wrap things up, here are 3 teams I think in the NHL could be interesting fits for a variety of different reasons for Ivan Ryabkin. First and foremost, we have the Calgary Flames, who do not own their own first-round selection this year. That was moved to the Montreal Canadiens in the Sean Monahan trade with about a million different conditions. So we'll see. Maybe they do still end up holding on to that. But at the moment, as things stand, they would not be. And that would be the 17th overall selection based on current standings. But they do have the first-round picks of both the Florida Panthers and the New Jersey Devils from the Matthew Tkachuk and Jacob Markstrom trades, respectively. I think with one of those two picks, especially having two shots at talent in the first round, a guy like Ryabkin, if he falls into that range, would be really enticing. There's upside, there's potential to work towards, and there'd be another player selected right there that can get you a bit more, perhaps a guaranteed piece if the risk scares you with Ryabkin. I don't think we're going to see Ryabkin be the first selection a team makes on day one of the draft. I think he might be a guy that a team like Calgary, who has multiple picks, takes a swing on, takes that risk on, because it's a little bit more mitigated by the draft. The Chicago Blackhawks, I think, would also make some sense. Ryabkin's a different profile of center than they have in their system. Of course, they already have Connor Bedard, so there's no pressure for Ryabkin to become that number one guy. And you also have guys like Frank Nazar, Oliver Moore, Sacha Boisvert, all very good prospects who can play down the middle. Nazar and Moore, very speedy, a bit undersized. Boisvert brings that physicality, a bit more comparable to Ryabkin, but he's a goal scorer rather than a playmaker first. So this would be a different profile that you can add into that forward core. It gives you more flexibility, being able to play natural centers on the wing as well, depending how that middle six shakes out at the end of the day. And I think that he'd be an interesting fit, especially with the limitations and pressure to be the guy or one of the guys in Chicago. Last but not least, for some similar reasons, the San Jose Sharks, who actually I wanted to specify as well with the Chicago Blackhawks. I'm not talking about their actual first pick, which could be as high as first or second overall. I'm talking about the more depth pick that they got from the Toronto Maple Leafs in the Jake McCabe, Sam Lafferty deal. So that would be around the 23rd overall range on draft day if Ryabkin were available there. Then we have the San Jose Sharks, who just recently acquired a first-round draft selection later on in the class, projected as 27th overall from the San Jose Sharks, where they traded away Mikhail Granlund and Cody Ceci, and also got a fourth-round pick alongside the first for their troubles. So I think that in San Jose, Ryabkin would also not have that pressure because of a guy like Macklin Celebrini's ahead of him in the lineup, and there's more complementary toolkits surrounding him. Players like Igor Chernyshov, Will Smith, and Quentin Musty come to mind as guys I think could play quite effectively on a line with Ivan Ryabkin. But that wraps things up here for this episode, my first episode as solo host of the podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform, please make sure to make us your first listen of the day. We always appreciate our everydayers who tune into our shows. For your second listen of the day, you can head on over to Locked On Fantasy Hockey, where Flip and Steel give you all the information you could possibly want in order to build the most cohesive and dangerous fantasy hockey lineup. If you're watching on YouTube, please comment, like, subscribe. Let us know what you thought about the episode. What do you want for this podcast moving forward? What were your thoughts about this episode and the use of the tactics board? I would love to hear feedback from you all. And please leave questions down below for our mailbag episode this week. But that wraps things up here for us at Locked On NHL Prospects. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we hope you tune back in very soon.